minutes. Now we're going to move to the Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana. Mr. Zaid, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the Standing Committee for your invitation to appear here today. We will be speaking on behalf of two organizations, Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana, also known as CFAMM, and the Arthritis Society. I am the founder and executive director of CFAMM, a national nonprofit organization focused on the needs of medical cannabis patients. The Arthritis Society, Canada's principal health charity providing education, programs, and support to the over 4.6 million Canadians living with arthritis. Over the past 2 years, the organizations have collaborated extensively on important issues surrounding medical cannabis research, access, and affordability. The brief submitted to the committee is a joint submission between the two groups, and any follow-up can be done with myself or Janet Yale, CEO of the Arthritis Society. You may recall Janet recently appeared before this committee on other issues, including national pharmacare. I'd also like to introduce Daphne Elisma, CFAMM's Quebec representative and a member of our Patient Advisory Board. She'll present in French momentarily. First, I'd like to share a bit about my personal story. So much of what we hear about cannabis is focused on the harms and risks, which of course are important issues, but my experience and the experience of many other patients is quite the opposite. On April 22, 2007, at the age of 14, I woke up with a constant headache that still remains today 24/7. This neurological condition, known as new daily persistent headache, is said to be one of the hardest pain conditions to treat. After trying over 40 prescription medications and all other therapies, I was near ready to give up. I had no quality of life. I could not leave the house due to noise, sensitivity, and low energy. I dropped out of grade 8 and struggled throughout high school. I finally turned to medical cannabis. It helped reduce painful flare-ups and allowed me to sleep. Although not a cure, the effective symptom management enabled me to concentrate and be successful in my academic studies. I advocated for insurance coverage and was the first in Canada to get successful insurance coverage for medical cannabis in this manner. Medical cannabis patients are often looked at as stereotypical stoners. Yet to myself, Daphne, and the patients we represent, effective symptom management translates to increased quality of life and functionality. Cannabis is a medicine. There are over 200,000 authorizations for the use of cannabis as a therapy to manage a variety of health conditions, including seizures, pain, insomnia, nausea and vomiting, and side effects from prescription medications. Although there is legal access to medical cannabis, there are still many challenges associated with its use. We need more research. Access to various product forms and retail distribution are important issues. And one of the most pressing concerns facing patients remains to be affordability. As the government progresses with legalization, one of the primary goals is to reduce consumption. Although laudable for recreational purposes, the government's goal ought not to be to restrict access to medical cannabis, a medicine, but rather to ensure a safe, reliable, and affordable supply for those who medically require it. There are three issues that we will be highlighting today: the importance of a distinct regulatory framework, research, and affordability, which Daphne will speak to. Although we need more research, a recent review by the U.S. National Academies found substantial evidence for the use of cannabinoids in conditions including chronic pain, MS, and chemotherapy-induced nausea. The two most studied cannabinoids are THC and CBD. THC, the cannabinoid that causes the stereotypical high associated with cannabis, has medical properties including analgesia. CBD, a non-impairing cannabinoid which has been shown to have anti-inflammatory and anticonvulsant effects, also limits the impairment and side effects caused by THC. Many patients use these two cannabinoids in combination to gain the most effective symptom management while limiting potential of impairment. Again, for most people using cannabis for medical purposes, this is not about getting high, but rather effective symptom management and increased quality of life. Cannabis is a legitimate medication, and it must be treated that way. And it's important that it be treated that way in a distinct regulatory framework. In crafting Bill C-45, we want to commend the government for recognizing the need to maintain a separate and distinct regulatory approach for medical cannabis, and we want to make sure that this is maintained. Beyond the government's constitutional requirements to provide reasonable access to cannabis for medical purposes, we believe cannabis and patients' needs are best suited to be addressed in a distinct regulatory framework. And moving forward, beyond Bill C-45, it is important that the government prioritizes and adequately supports the needs of patients by addressing their unmet needs. And of course, research is a very important issue. There is an enormous deficit of properly funded research in Canadian clinical trials into the therapeutic use of medical cannabis. This creates barriers to patient access as many physicians express reluctance to authorize medical cannabis in the absence of robust peer-reviewed research. The lack of scientific and clinical research has also been cited by Health Canada as a key reason why medical cannabis is not yet regulated as a therapeutic product, which affects the ability of patients to access medical cannabis through private or public drug plans. In particular, more research is needed in terms of dose, indication, and form. To that end, we have asked, as part of Budget 18, for the federal government to commit $25 million over 5 years to support medical cannabis research. This investment will go a long way towards expanding the evidence base for medical cannabis, and it's a small amount compared to the $274 million already proposed for enforcement. And although we fully support enforcement and research into the risks associated with recreational cannabis use, we believe it's necessary for the federal government to invest research specific to the medical use of cannabis. This is an urgent and vital step towards further understanding and recognizing the legitimate medical use of cannabis and ensuring the sustainability of a distinct regulatory framework. And in terms of improving access, we believe in addition to the continuation of mail order and personal production, pharmacies should have exclusive authority to retail medical cannabis and further product forms should be made available. Sales through pharmacies would go towards improving affordability, including the elimination of sales tax based on the Excise Tax Act and increasing the potential of insurance coverage. Pharmacists will help enable that patients across the country are able to receive reliable education on the safe and effective use from trained healthcare professionals with regulatory oversight. While retail and distribution decisions are largely provincial competencies, in order for pharmacy distribution to happen, the access to cannabis for medical purposes regulations will need to be amended. I will now pass it to Daphne to discuss affordability.
Après plus d'une décennie au sein de Santé Canada et en
After over a decade at Health Canada and in my capacity as a legal expert, I advocate for patients who use medicinal marijuana. In fact, I myself use CBD successfully to treat complex regional pain syndrome following a breast cancer treatment. The issue of affordability represents a major one for patients, the patients that we represent today, because medicinal marijuana is the most effective medication to treat their condition. We feel that that medical marijuana should be exempt from tax. When a patient procures a prescription medication for medical needs, the medication is exempt under federal legislation. Because medicinal marijuana meets these criteria, the government should make it free of sales tax as well, making it more affordable. We are asking for the adoption of policies and programs that facilitate the reimbursement of medicinal marijuana under public and private plans. We recommend that the government approve cannabis as a therapeutical product, assigning it a medication identification number and facilitating its reimbursement. In summary, patients who use cannabis to alleviate their physical and psychological conditions feel discriminated against. The government is drawing a distinction between these patients and those who use conventional medications such as opioids to treat the same condition. Patients often feel obliged to use an opiate instead of cannabis because of its lack of affordability. Taxation and a lack of reimbursement of medical marijuana represent an excessive constraint for patients. The improvement of the rights of patients who use medicinal marijuana must remain at the heart of these discussions. I thank the committee members for this opportunity to address myself to you today.
And now we go to Ms. Bogdan. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee again this morning. I will ask the committee's understanding. My voice, I got a bit of a cold in the last few days, so my voice is not as good as on Monday, but we'll do the best that we can. As public servants, my colleague and I, Mr. David Pellman, who's responsible for the Office of Medical Cannabis, as public servants, we're responsible for administering on behalf of Health Canada, the current regulatory framework that enables Canadians to have access to cannabis for medical purposes. Mr. Chair, I'd like to provide the committee with an overview of the regulatory framework focusing on 4 areas. One is how the current framework is designed, how it works, and the number of Canadians who presently benefit from it. 2, I will outline the robust requirements and controls that apply to licensed production of cannabis and that are designed to protect public health and safety. 3, I will describe some of the key improvements that Health Canada has made to the program over the last 6 months. And finally, I'll outline why and how this framework would be preserved under the proposed Cannabis Act that is before you. Mr. Chair, Canada has had a system of access to cannabis for medical purposes in some form since the late 1990s. The regulatory regime was put in place following a court decision that determined that the Government of Canada must provide some lawful means for Canadians to have access and possess cannabis for medical purposes. The framework has evolved considerably over time as the government has introduced improvements and has responded to a number of court challenges and decisions. Most recently, in April 2016, the federal court determined that the regulatory framework that was in place did not provide individuals with reasonable access to cannabis for medical purposes. In this instance, reasonable access was defined as having access to available and affordable cannabis. In response to this decision, Health Canada introduced a new regulatory framework, which is called the Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes Regulations, a little over a year ago. Under this new regime, Canadians who have the authorization of their healthcare practitioner can access cannabis in one of 3 ways: by purchasing quality-controlled cannabis from a federally licensed producer. Individuals register directly with the licensed producer, and the product is delivered securely to their home, either through the mail or by courier. Individuals also have the option to register with Health Canada to produce a limited amount of cannabis at home, or to designate someone to produce it for them. As I mentioned, Canadians must have the authorization of their healthcare practitioner in order to access cannabis for medical purposes. Health Canada believes that the decision to use cannabis for medical purposes is one that is best made by a healthcare practitioner and his or her patient. Health Canada provides information designed specifically for healthcare practitioners on its website. The department also works closely with provincial and territorial regulatory authorities, which in turn provide guidance to the healthcare practitioners in their jurisdiction. Healthcare practitioners are authorizing cannabis as a treatment for a wide range of symptoms associated with medical conditions, including nausea in patients undergoing chemotherapy, loss of appetite and weight loss associated with HIV/AIDS, and pain and spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis and arthritis. At this time, under the new regulations, there are more than 210,000 active authorizations for the use of cannabis for medical purposes. Of this number, 200,000 active registrations are with the federally licensed producers, and individuals purchase their product directly from them. 10,000 individuals are registered with Health Canada to produce a limited amount of cannabis at home, or to designate someone to do it for them. The number of client registrations with licensed producers is continuing to grow at a rate of approximately 9% a month since licensed production began in 2013. The number of healthcare practitioners that are authorizing the use of cannabis has also grown steadily. There are now 10,000 healthcare practitioners authorizing use, which has doubled since June 2015. Mr. Chair, I would now like to describe briefly the system of regulated production of cannabis in Canada. There are currently 58 producers that are licensed to produce cannabis for medical purposes. These producers are the only legal commercial source for regulated quality-controlled cannabis for medical purposes in Canada. The regulatory framework sets out a series of strict requirements that must be met to protect the health and safety of Canadians and the integrity of the legal system. For example, licensed producers are required to use good production practices in their facilities, such as a sanitary program and having a dedicated person responsible for quality assurance. They must test each and every lot for mold, bacteria, and other potential contaminants before those products can be released for sale to the public. Licensed producers must also test each lot for THC and CBD potency, and those results must be displayed on the label. In terms of preventing diversion to the illegal market and ensuring the integrity of the legal system, all license holders, directors of corporation, and all senior personnel in the facility must have a security clearance. This security and clearance involves a criminal record check as well as a law enforcement record check to identify any known associations or affiliations with organized crime. In addition, all facilities must have physical security and inventory control measures to prevent theft or diversion. These standards and controls are backed by rigorous compliance and enforcement. Last year, Health Canada inspected each facility an average of 7 to 8 times, conducting roughly 275 inspections. These inspections verify that good production practices are being met, the test results for all products that are produced, that only authorized pesticides are being used, and they review inventory records and the security control measures that are in place in these facilities. I will also note that Canada's system of regulated production of cannabis is recognized internationally. We receive frequent visits and calls from other countries for advice on our patient-focused approach, strict licensing regime, and our compliance and enforcement program. Mr. Chair, I will now outline some recent improvements to help ensure that Canadians continue to have reasonable access to cannabis and can have confidence in the quality-controlled supply of cannabis for medical purposes. In May this year, Health Canada announced that it will require all licensed producers to conduct mandatory testing of all cannabis products for the presence of unauthorized pesticides. In addition, Health Canada is conducting unannounced inspections of all licensed producers and randomly testing lots and products for unauthorized pesticides. Also, in May this year, Health Canada added additional resources and introduced a number of improvements to streamline the licensing of producers and enable increased production of cannabis while maintaining quality control and oversight. These measures will also help ensure that a legal, quality-controlled supply of cannabis would be available should the proposed Cannabis Act be approved by Parliament. Mr. Chair, the question of whether to retain a separate framework for access to cannabis for medical purposes was a key question that the government asked the task force of experts on cannabis legalization and regulation to consider. The task force consulted broadly, as you know, and extensively with experts in public health, law enforcement, patients and advocates, including the others who have joined me at the table today, as well as licensed producers. During these consultations, the task force heard how cannabis is making a difference to Canadians living with serious health challenges, such as cancer, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, and fibromyalgia. They also heard about the role that cannabis can play in pain management and palliative care and the relief that cannabis offers to children with severe forms of epilepsy. Based on their findings, the task force recommended that the government maintain a separate medical access framework to support patients. It also recommended that the government monitor and evaluate patients' reasonable access during the implementation of this new legislation and evaluate within 5 years. The government has accepted the advice of the task force, and the proposed Cannabis Act that is before you will enable the framework to continue. In closing, Mr. Chair, I wish to emphasize that Health Canada is committed to enabling Canadians to have reasonable access to cannabis for medical purposes. We will continue to monitor closely, as we do today, and be prepared to take additional measures if necessary. Finally, we will continue to seek the feedback of patients and producers to continuously improve how we administer and ensure that Canadians are well served by the program. And we would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, now we'll go to our first round of 7-minute questions, and we'll start with Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Ms. Bogdan. Mr. Zaid has, in his presentation, has asked for a drug identification number to be assigned to cannabis. I was wondering how that would work, whether there are issues with that, and what would be involved.
Thank you for that question. Cannabis can be classified as a therapeutic drug under the Food and Drugs Act if a company wishes to market a drug in Canada, there is a process that they can go through to apply to do so. And Health Canada would review the evidence that is put forward to verify the product's safety, efficacy, and quality. Part of the process involves presenting results of preclinical and clinical studies that have been conducted either in Canada or overseas, and details regarding the production and the packaging of the drug and a number of other aspects. So at this time, cannabis itself, either in its dried, fresh, or oil form, has not been authorized as a therapeutic product. No company has brought forward an application or the clinical evidence that would be required. However, I would point out that a number of cannabis-based drugs, there are in fact 2, have been approved, have undergone the market authorization process, have received a DIN, and as such are available for sale and would be eligible for reimbursement from plans.
Okay, so apart from those 2 products, I mean, producer or manufacturer hasn't come forward and said, listen, we want a DIN for this product, and here's the evidence, and so on and so forth. Okay. Mr. Zaid, can you give us any feedback regarding that? Have you talked to people about applying for such an identification number?
Yeah, so we'd absolutely love to see a drug identification number application put forward by a drug company, but one of the issues surrounding cannabis and what makes it unique is that it's a plant. It's not a patentable molecule, and that's typically what the Therapeutic Drug Directorate regulates. So when talking about cannabis, there's a wide range of indications. So really, it does come back to the research. We really need to focus on medical cannabis-specific research. And the government has an obligation, we believe, in this role, because of the limited patentability of cannabis, to really incentivize research and ensure that we have the research needed to get to that DIN. But really, in the interim, we do believe cannabis should be assigned a DIN or something equivalent to start facilitating reimbursement, as it's such a vital issue for patients across the country.
It sounds like there's not enough research, and needs it just needs people to enter the formal process to make that happen. And you're not aware of anybody having started such a process? In
terms of the application process, but there are definitely some small-scale clinical trials ongoing by some of the licensed producers, but it's not nearly to the degree that we would like to see it. We'd also like to see the $25 million invested to CIHR so that they can grant it out so that it's unbiased research, not necessarily sponsored by drug companies as well. So really it does come back to the research and again, the patentability, as well as really the wide range of indications means that there's a lot of research to be done, expensive clinical research. The Arthritis Society, about a couple years ago, held a forum, brought all the researchers together, and created a report that set out a list of priorities. So now we have the priorities, we know what we need to study, we really just need the funding to enable us to do that.
I think Ms. Black would like to respond to this. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, part of the, there is quite a lot of great research around medical cannabis. It's large-scale human clinical trials that is really where the dearth of research is. And we have to remember that we're talking about a plant that's been prohibited for almost 100 years. So people that have been wanting to research it, it's been impossible to find a legal, consistent supply. It's very onerous and takes an extremely long time to get licensing, even for laboratories. So one of the things that this government can do besides funding research is to encourage, facilitate, and expedite it in any way that's in your power to do so.
I mean, you say there's a lot of research out there, though, but unless someone starts a process for an application, it's not going to do anything to achieve a drug identification number.
I mean, as Jonathan said, there is some complications around cannabis because it isn't patentable. But, you know, my understanding would be that if the government allocated some resources and from your side encouraged research into the medical applications of cannabis rather than holding it back, that we would be able to start seeing more progress.
I see.
Right there, did you?
If I could offer, one, I perhaps should have said that in my first answer to the committee member's question, Mr. Chair, is that, the proposed Cannabis Act would provide greater flexibility for the minister to authorize different types of cannabis research than we do now. And what I mean by that is, it would improve the current process, which requires individuals to seek an exemption in order to be able to do this kind of research. So I think, one of the virtues of the proposed legislation is that it will enable and facilitate research. And I perhaps should have mentioned that from the outset.
Ms. Black, I believe you're asking for prescriptions to be issued instead of authorizations, and you feel that it would be better, give better access to the product. Is that correct?
Well, because the current medical regulations, the ACMPR, we call the authorization to cannabis an authorization rather than calling it a prescription, because this is like the chicken and the egg, back to the fact that it's not an approved medicine, and so we can't technically call it a prescription because it isn't actually an approved medicine. But by calling it an authorization and not a prescription, that is the answer that many people come to on the dead end of trying to either get insurance coverage, and the reason why the tax courts said that GST is applicable to medical cannabis.
My understanding, though, is that doctors are reluctant to issue prescriptions because they don't have the research to back them up. They don't know the specific medical consequences of particular potencies and so forth, so that I suspect they would be less likely to issue a prescription than they would issue an authorization.
I mean, I am not a physician, but I do communicate with many physicians regularly, and I would suggest that the authorization form that physicians currently have to fill out actually takes more time and is more onerous than filling out a prescription on a prescription pad. So I think whether we call it a prescription or an authorization, it's not going to address the issue of the research and education that is needed for physicians across the country.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mr. Weber.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel for being here today. And I also want to thank Ms. Black and Mr. Vanderbeek for the work that you do and you have done for the last 20 years. I am a strong advocate for medical marijuana. My wife, at 37 years old, diagnosed stage 4 breast cancer, going through incredible chemotherapy and radiation, and the nausea was intense. It was uncontrollable, to the point where there was desperation. We had to go to the illicit market to get marijuana, to try it, and it worked. It worked for her nausea. Of course, back then, we had no idea what was in it. Obviously, there was strong THC in it, which caused a lot of bad experiences, but it took away her nausea. So to be able to come to an outlet where they can prescribe at the proper marijuana for patients who suffer like that, I think is vital to Canadians. And so I, again, am a strong advocate there. One question I have is, you talked about some of your young patients, and of course, Mr. Zaid being a young individual as well, requiring marijuana. I'm happy that you found something that helps your headaches, by the way. And I ask you both, are you not concerned about the strong scientific evidence of the correlation between use as a youth and mental issues because of your developing brain? Maybe I'll start with Mr. Zaid.
First of all, yeah, of course I'm concerned about that. I mean, but I think it's a different context when we're speaking about medical use from other recreational use. Again, I tried 40 prescription medications. Not one of those medications was ever studied in my condition. None, no research whatsoever. They had side effects that included death, included cognitive impairment, right? And these were given to me without any of these types of questions. So I think it comes back to, when you're suffering a medical condition, there's risks to alternative treatments. There's risks to not having effective treatments. So for me, the risks really weren't comparable to the benefits that it could afford me, and I think that's the issue with lots of patients. And the second aspect I would propose is also, we talk a lot about cannabis as a whole, but really there's hundreds of chemicals within the plant itself. THC does have some research that, is concerning regarding adolescent brain development, but lots of the pediatric patients are on pure CBD, and that research isn't correlated to the brain development. So with those two aspects, the medical context as well as different cannabinoids that may be being used, I think, there is definitely potential among young people.
Is it the CBD that helps you in your headaches? Or
Yeah,
is
so-
it a mixture of both, or is it the THC? What has helped you?
Yeah, so it's a mixture. During the day, I usually use mainly CBD. I'm on cannabis right now. I don't think anyone would think I'm impaired. Most people wouldn't think I have a very severe chronic illness either, right? I have effective symptom management. I'm not high. I use a bit of THC at night. It helps me sleep, and that's such an important thing to having a healthy lifestyle. So overall, it's really effective to improving my quality of life.
Ms. Elisma, you mentioned that you're a cancer survivor, and you continue to use CBD. You mentioned in your presentation. I understand that marijuana is good for nausea and such, but why would you continue to take it after your treatments?
Une chose que j'ai pas mentionnée dans mon introduction tout à l'heure, c'est que
One thing that I didn't mention in my introduction earlier was that in addition to my medication for chronic pain, I also developed migraines, which are very persistent. So CBD, well, my treatment is CBD, but there's also THC, which improves my quality of life. And currently, I have no problem with migraines. They've completely disappeared since I started this treatment. Before, I was using a number of different prescription medications, like naproxen, very powerful medications that created difficulties, health problems. And so when I turned to medicinal marijuana, it really greatly helped me have a better quality of life. So it's a treatment that I wish to continue.
Bogdan, you described licensed producers and the strict requirements that they have to adhere to, and I had the opportunity to tour a licensed facility north of Calgary, which you described it accurately. It was like entering a federal prison to get in there to begin with. But yes, sanitary requirements. You can eat off the floor. It was that clean and very, very impressive anyways. And I encourage all our members to, if you have the opportunity to tour one of these licensed producers. With respect to a comment you made about strict clearance for licensed producers, we've had a number of presentations here where people have recommended that we allow individuals who have had past experience, perhaps even convicted marijuana convictions, to allow them to apply for licenses and be accepted for that. Can I ask what your thoughts are on that?
Well, I think the government puts in place. We have a process around the security clearances that is in place principally for two reasons, right? One is to protect the integrity of the system, of the legal system as it stands now. And also to protect it against diversion. So very consciously have made decisions around the requirements for security clearances for all of the key individuals in the organizations. And it's an important feature of the system and would continue to be going forward if we want to ensure that the system isn't infiltrated by organized crime. So while we are certainly aware of the positions that others have put forward, and those will be taken into consideration as the regulations are designed in the future, I think we also need to remember the objectives that the government has in protecting the integrity of the system.
Okay.
Go to Mr. Davies.
Chair, thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Zaid, in what form do you ingest your cannabis?
I mainly ingest via vaporization as well as some capsules. I find personally it's the most effective for me, but I definitely would like to try other product forms, including sublingual tinctures and creams for nerve pain. These products aren't available within the system, and you know, there was a Supreme Court case that ruled that patients should have access to a diverse range of products. Health Canada responded to that by allowing the sale of oils and capsules, but there's limited potency in the capsules, which is a big problem, and there's still not basic products like creams available. So we would like to see a wider range of products.
Madame Elisma, how do you ingest your cannabis? Do you smoke it or do you take it in some other form?
Comme Monsieur Zaid,
Like Mr. Zaid, I use a vaporizer, and I also take it in oil form, which I purchase from legally, and it helps me manage my pain symptoms. So I also use the dried form sometimes. Sometimes I smoke it, depending on my daily needs. But mainly, I vape it, and I use it in oil form. Thank you.
You testified about the licensed producers. There's a very, you call it a strict licensing regime. You test for pesticides and mold. You test for CBD, THC levels. You test for sanitation and safety. There's inspections. None of that is being done for edible manufacturers today, is it?
Well, what licensed producers under the current system are allowed to produce is dried cannabis and cannabis oil,
Right.
which can come in many forms.
No, I understand that. So
Right.
edibles are not part of that regime. None of that testing regime you described applies to anybody making edibles in this country right now. Am I correct in that?
You mean an individual who is allowed to produce a limited amount of cannabis at home?
Anybody who's making edibles products for sale in this country, illegally or otherwise, are not subjected to that testing regime, is what I'm trying to establish.
Well, no.
Right. Now, Ms. Black, one of your recommendations is, I quote, ensure legal access to cannabis products in all of its various forms and potencies, including but not limited to herbal cannabis, capsules, tinctures, topicals, resins, and finished edible products. Otherwise, patients will continue to access them in the unregulated market. This move would bring federal policy in line with the recent Supreme Court ruling R. and Smith 2015. Can you elaborate on that and maybe explain the reference to the Smith case?
Certainly. You heard from Kirk Tusaw yesterday evening. I wish that he was here today to speak in more detail about that case. My understanding is that the spirit of that ruling essentially ensured that there's charter protection for patients to use cannabis in all of its forms. And we see that at our organization, that we have a very broad range of forms that cannabis can be used in, many of which have been named here. And I think that if all of those products are not included in the legal market moving forward, if these regulations don't follow the spirit of that Supreme Court ruling, even though it's about patients, but applying it to the recreational market, that again, we're just going to have all of those products being produced in an unregulated environment. One of my greatest concerns is that some cannabis concentrates for inhalation are made with carcinogenic solvents currently. Like butane is actually a solvent that people use to make inhalable extracts. And if it's not produced correctly, it can have carcinogenic remains left in the product. So in fact, potent inhaled products are one of the most important things for the government to regulate.
Now, in terms of the BC Compassion Club Society, what percentage of products are your patients and customers purchasing that are not, that fall into the edible, concentrate, and non-smokable form?
I would say probably roughly about 30%. However, on the edibles, since the City of Vancouver had demanded essentially that everybody stop having edibles for sale, we stopped carrying them. We wanted to obviously stay compliant with the city bylaws. Mm-hmm. So let's say in the last couple of years that number has been a little hard to figure out, but yeah, I'd say roughly 30-35%.
And we've heard some testimony on labeling products. I'm wondering what advice you'd give this committee on what kind of information should be on a package to help a consumer, I guess, make an informed choice of the cannabis product they may choose.
I have some concerns about plain packaging requirements. One being that, again, it will give an advantage to unregulated producers to be able to, create colorful or attractive packaging. Anything that you restrict in the legal market that the unregulated market can do, you're going to create an advantage. In our experience, it's very important to be able to have some product information. And also, I think that there is some sort of branding that's necessary for consumers to be able to distinguish about who the producer is, what the company is that they're buying cannabis from. So I think that this is a place where this committee will need to really find a balance between labeling restrictions and also being reasonable about it. Again, if we look at the way that we're able to package alcohol, which we know is more harmful than cannabis, that you're able to have product information and some branding, some fonts, some colors on the packaging. I think that if we want to restrict things like cartoons or things that would really specifically, draw the attention of children, I think that's reasonable.
Thank you. And dispensaries versus pharmacies. Do you have any opinion on the?
Well, this is a very complex issue. The pharmacies have, the governing bodies of the pharmacies for a long time have said that they are very opposed to medical cannabis, and it's not until quite recently that they have come along realizing that there's quite a large and profitable business to be had being a distributor of medical cannabis. So I do believe that cannabis should be in pharmacies. I think that that's one way to give equal access to patients across the country, but I absolutely do not think it should be exclusively in pharmacies. Last year, I had the privilege of organizing a special meeting of patients for the Task Force on Legalization with CFAMM and the Arthritis Society. And we had a wonderful half-day meeting with a diverse group of patients. And there was only a few of them who wanted to only access cannabis within a pharmacy. Mandy McKnight, who is here, will talk to you about the problems that she has when she goes to get her pharmaceuticals for Liam in a pharmacy, and how what she really wants is something like what the Compassion Club has, which is a specialized medical cannabis storefront where people can come. We will spend 60 to 90 minutes educating them. We will spend the time talking about all of the different possible products and how to take them very safely. And we have the experience and the expertise and the care to take care of medical cannabis patients in a way that I think is superior to what any pharmacy can provide.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Davies. Now we go to Mr. Ayoub.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask the question in French, so if you need the here, please do so. Je voudrais commencer par Monsieur Van der Beek.
I would like to start with Mr. Van der Beek. You mentioned earlier that while you don't do production, but you sell cannabis. And how do you ensure that you have a price below the market? What is the price of cannabis currently per gram?
Roughly about $4.84 a gram. Normally we purchase by the pound, so
Okay.
it's prorated.
OK. Donc, merci pour le...
Thank you for that answer. I've heard a lot between $10 a gram and more at different levels, but this is an important point to ensure that we remove the black market, the illegal market in organized crime. You mentioned that you have providers who are clear, who are not members of organized crime, and that's good that you have moved in this sense. That's what I've understood.
Madame Bogdan, question pour vous.
Ms. Bogdan, a question for you. Among the producers who are authorized, you said there are 58 of them. You said you have 275 inspections that you carry out. Have you made any observations of infiltration or breaches by organized crime? Are there any producers who have had their licenses withdrawn or amended following the issue of infiltration of organized crime?
Mr. Chair, for the question, no. The answer is no. And I think part of that is in the design of the system, the very strict controls that we have up front in relation to security and who can be involved in the industry.
J'ai une autre question suite à votre réponse.
I have another question to follow up on your answer. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Rick Barnum the commissioner of the organized crime in the division at the OPP mentioned earlier that it's certain that organized crime has infiltrated cannabis producers, licensed cannabis producers. He seemed to be very adamant in his testimony earlier this week. What is your response to that?
Categorically say with respect to the licensed producers that would be untrue to our knowledge, and that if anyone had evidence to the contrary, I think it would be very important to bring that to the attention of the RCMP and others, and ultimately ourselves, if there was a concern of that kind.
OK. Donc, il y a lieu.
So perhaps he should have done more in-depth research on the issue. I think it's concerning, potentially. Another thing, and without asking questions, if I correctly understood what Ms. Elisma, Mr. Zaid, and Mr. Black are, they are seeking a bin number. No requests were made by anyone, no industry, no producer. Is cannabis in a class of its own? It is a vegetable. It is a plant product. It's medicinal to a certain point. We need more research to provide more administrative proof, and some scientific evidence has been shown. What is preventing us, and what would be your recommendations? What is preventing us from amending the regulations to have a tailor-made process for cannabis? What would be your recommendations to the minister to make a change to the process to allow doctors to prescribe this and to not have an authorization, a long authorization form to fill out? Do we need something shorter? What do you recommend?
That's a question that actually the task force itself, the task force on cannabis legalization, considered in its deliberations on the medical access system, given the input and feedback that it received from patients and advocates about whether there couldn't be a separate pathway considered in order to be able to authorize these drugs, or a different way to do it. I think that after careful consideration and deliberation, that the task force came to the conclusion that the system that exists now can work, that the government should do what it can to encourage research, including by making the changes that it is making through this legislation that would encourage research at the clinical, preclinical, or clinical level at universities, or research that might be funded by licensed producers. That the system that we have works, and that by encouraging research, we will probably see increased research in those areas that would lead to market authorization for cannabis in its dried or other forms.
On est encore jusqu'à maintenant.
Up till now, we're seeing that this has been a failure, or there's a problem because no producers have made this request, because I'm assuming that there were likely failure. They suspect they would be a failure before they even applied, and they're taking it for granted. So they're not submitting the application. Therefore, there's no bin number, and doctors can't prescribe it for medical purposes. And I think that we'll never be able to solve this if we don't change something in this process to allow, well, it's already been proven to have medical benefits, but it seems that there's a gap in the administrative process, and for a few years now, we still don't have a solution a few years later. And I think that this is a gap that needs to be addressed quickly. That's my recommendation if I were in your place.
Sure. So perhaps what I would offer for the committee is that while cannabis for medical purposes has been used, as the other panelists acknowledged, for a very long time, the system that we have in place in Canada, the regulated system of access, has only been around. It was only created at the very end of 2013. So we are 3 years in to the establishment and to growing and developing a licensed industry that's capable of producing quality-controlled cannabis. I think it's reasonable to appreciate that it will take a bit more time. As other panelists have indicated, licensed producers have, in their own right, been funding research in conjunction with universities across the country. We do have, I think, close to 12 universities that are undertaking research, preclinical, clinical, and other research that in the area of cannabis for medical purposes. So it's emerging, it's starting. Perhaps we can give it time to see if it will succeed. The process we have in place for approval of drugs, it works. So I think we can.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Time's up. That completes our first round of 7-minute questions. We'll now go to a round of 5-minute questions, and we're going to start with Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I'm well acquainted with the excellent controls in the medical cannabis regime. Now, a question for Ms. Brogdon. We had a witness last night allege that because of the way we've implemented medical marijuana in Canada, it actually is causing us to violate 3 international treaties. Is that even true?
I guess I'll acknowledge, of course, that Canada is signatory to 3 international conventions and quite aware of our obligations and take those obligations quite seriously. With this new legislation, I think the government has made pretty clear that its intention is to put public health and safety first. That's why it's seeking to put in place a new, more effective control framework. We recognize, of course, that there will be questions raised about our international obligations. I think our focus right now at this point in time, given that the legislation has only been introduced and the study has just begun in Parliament, which is an important part of our democratic process, our focus right now is on reaching out to those international partners, explaining the content of the legislation, what the government's objectives are, and what it is that we're seeking to do so that that is well understood. And I think that we're also trying to help our partners understand the situation that Canada has in Canada, that exists in Canada today, in terms of youth use, in terms of the illegal market and what that represents. And that is, I think, the focus of our efforts at this point in time.
Okay, so you don't think we're out of compliance now. It's just a question of whether the legislation will complicate that.
I'm not the best person that's not my background, to express an opinion or advise you on whether we are or we aren't in compliance at this point.
Okay. Well, let me switch gears then. One of the things that we've heard consistently is that we need to have public awareness and education on cannabis and on its impacts, and it should be directed at parents, it should be directed at youth. So what is the current status of the development of the public awareness program within the Department of Health and the rollout?
Okay, thank you for that question. So proactive public education and awareness activities, is very important, and the government, considers that a central feature of its approach to protecting health and safety and minimizing the risks of cannabis use. That's why the government made an initial investment in the most recent budget of $9.6 million, so that we could begin those public education and awareness activities now. A significant focus of our efforts at this point in time are to reach out to young people and to parents of young people and others who influence them, to encourage them to have conversations about the risks of cannabis use and the dangers to their safety of driving or driving with others who might be impaired.
Specific programs, like are there specific packages that people can access or?
Sure. Well, one good example, which you might have heard about earlier this week, would be from Drug Free Kids Canada. Health Canada has been working with them. They produced a quite excellent guide.
Yeah, we heard about them because
parents.
they've gone to 100,000, I think, parents.
Yes. Yeah, they have.
Okay.
They have.
What about the young people, the education for them?
Education for them. So we have produced a number of information pieces for them that's available on our website. We've been promoting that through social media since last January with a very high take-up rate through all of the ways that we most commonly kids like to get their information on their mobile devices. So we're very cognizant that we need to do that. We're in the midst of preparing some educational videos now that would be available on YouTube, which is also another way that kids really like to be able to get that kind of information. Really being focused on presenting the facts. We've done some public opinion research on young people and how they like to get information. They really want to have the facts and make up their own mind. They don't want preachy messages. So we're going to make every effort to actually engage youth in the further development of our campaign.
Okay, very good. Thanks. One last question, and this one I think for Ms. Black. So one of the concerns I have is that when recreational cannabis becomes legal, and it sort of looks to me like the same situation that happens when, pharmaceutical drugs that used to be behind the counter end up being, available in all the pharmacies anywhere, and then health benefit companies quit covering them. Do you think there is a potential for that to happen with medical cannabis?
I'm afraid I don't totally understand your question because cannabis doesn't currently have any coverage. So can you reframe the question for me so I can try and do a better job of answering it?
This is news to me then. So no health benefit company will reimburse.
There's very few. Jonathan is a bit more of an expert in it. There's a small handful of patients across the country that have managed to advocate for themselves to acquire cost coverage for their medical cannabis, but it's very rare, which is why a lot of the recommendations that Jonathan and I are both making are to make systematic changes, including my suggestion that the federal government include medical cannabis in the health plan for your own employees as a leadership initiative, because this is one of the greatest struggles that patients are facing. I mean, there are 2 federal employees in the room today who are going, massively into debt and looking at remortgaging their homes to be able to acquire the amount of medicine that they need.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Got time?
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Ms. Sidhu.
My questions to Ms. Bogdan. You said the cannabis could be classified as a therapeutic product with the drug identification number if a business applies. Is this a hard process to apply for?
Is it a hard process to apply for?
Mm-hmm. We heard from our witnesses earlier there's an educational certificate when they are doing it. Is there any system set up for them when they are applying for that license? Or I imagine more companies might be willing to do so. They can apply, but is there any system set up there? They have to is educating for the
on how to apply to market a drug in Canada, do you mean?
Yeah, to take a license when they are doing, when they are applying for that.
When they apply for that
license.
So when they're applying to market the drug, I have to say I'm not responsible for that program in particular. So
Is there any educational campaign?
Yeah. To help companies apply? I don't believe so, but I would imagine, I'm almost certain that there would be information available on Health Canada's website about how to apply to seek a market authorization and the requirements that companies have to fulfill in submitting the application. I mentioned some of the requirements already, the need for preclinical and clinical studies. So that's the actual research that will demonstrate the efficacy and the quality and the safety of the product. And they also have to provide details on how it will be produced, how it will be packaged, labeled, and additional information about the therapeutic claims and any side effects of the drugs. So those are the kinds of things they need to submit. But I'm sure that there is information that's available to them. And public servants are usually pretty good at helping people when they need information to apply. So I would imagine that we try to be as helpful as we can.
And I also heard the authorization number and DIN number. So is there any, right now on DIN number, there's a prescription fee. So authorization number, is there any fee available? Like when it medicinal marijuana, if they got the DIN number, is there any extra prescription fee will be there?
Okay, so right now under the
when it's going to be legal after that, I'm talking.
Will there be an additional fee? Maybe I'll answer your question by saying how it is now. So now if a person wishes to access cannabis for medical purposes, they go to their doctor and they get a document which the doctor will fill out, and we provide an example, or we'll take something as long as they give the right information. And that's a medical authorization. So it's not a prescription. As Ms. Black was explaining earlier, a prescription can only be used for a drug that is authorized for sale in Canada, right? So we have an equivalent, which is a document that the doctor signs that clearly indicates how much they're authorized to use, and we'll sign and date that and for what period of time. And that is what an individual would take to a licensed producer to register and then be able to access cannabis.
Next question is the maintain quality control. Is there any recall process in the place?
In the event that there's necessary, absolutely. There are rules in the regulations that would give Health Canada the power, if it needed to require a mandatory recall. In most of the instances of recalls that we've seen since the system began, those recalls, when companies discover instances or concerns, they will undertake a voluntary recall. They're quite conscious of their obligations under the regulations and not putting public health and safety at risk, and so they will initiate those recalls, as a precautionary measure. In any instances that we've uncovered through our inspections, that's how it's happened.
So how we can regulate the similar price? Like someone say it's a $4.54 a gram, and we also heard it's a $10 per gram. So how we can regulate the similar price? Is there any system in the place?
Right. In terms of the price prices of licensed producers, I guess the first thing I would say is that we keep a very close eye on availability, pricing, and the variety of cannabis that's available in the market. Licensed producers are required to report to us, I think David will help me, on a monthly basis. Yep. On a monthly basis, and it's through that collecting of systematic data and a number of other sources that we keep an eye on what is going on. In terms of the price that's available now from suppliers, the average price is about $9. But licensed producers offer a range of products that can be between $4 and $18 per gram, depending on what the product is and the format in which it is sold.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now we go to Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you very much for the witnesses for being here today. Very, very good testimony. And I want to express the importance, like you pointed out, the difference between medicinal marijuana and the recreational marijuana, because I think everybody around the table here, we want to make sure that we ensure the health and safety of Canadians. But many people using medicinal marijuana are very ill. And before this business, I'm a chiropractor, and I saw a lot of people with chronic pain after years of whether it's just non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. They've chosen to move into marijuana with much less side effects and much better results. So there's definitely a really good role here in our healthcare system. But again, looking about the health and safety of Canadians, I know people have brought up home cultivation and quality control inspection. I know Health Canada, even a huge bureaucracy, we've had issues, mentioned recalls. There's been marijuana made available to patients that had fungicides, pesticides, carcinogens in it. And the worry is, even with medicinal marijuana, there seems to be a challenge to make sure that that's inspected, make sure it's safe. So I wanted to ask you about homegrown and about quality control, because really, how do you manage that? And should there be, or is there a difference between home growing for medicinal use and home growing for recreational use? Do you have comments on that?
So in terms of medicinal use, we definitely have comments. Health Canada has taken steps over the past 6 months or year or so to allow patients who are authorized to home grow to be able to submit their products to a lab for testing. Of course, there's issues with affordability. Testing at a lab is difficult for patients, and lots of people are producing at home because of affordability, so it's inaccessible in lots of ways, even though we do commend them for taking that step, because before patients had no testing abilities. And in terms of the health and safety risks, I would say that lots of this, as we move out of prohibition, should fall under bylaws, safety codes, those kinds of things to ensure people are having safe wirings, but and no fire risk. But it definitely can be done safely. It just people need to have proper education on how to do so.
All right, Madame Black, do you have a comment on that or no?
No, I think Jonathan covered it.
That one of the things we've heard, we heard from Colorado, and when we're talking about recreational use. The comment was made when we did it, we're like flying a plane while building it. And one of the things they asked us to do or advised us to do is not to do the same, slow down, make sure that you get it right. They recommended that we have things in place like public education, baseline data and data collection abilities, treatment research. And I notice in your recommendations, both of you are recommending more money for research. And really with 288 days, a lot of the witnesses are kind of wondering, is this an opportunity lost? I was wondering if you could comment, because you are on the ground, you're helping patients. Do you have access to programs through Health Canada or the government if you're trying to educate your patients? If it's anything from how to do a proper homegrown, for example, or how to utilize it? Data collection, so that when you're dealing with patients, you can actually say patient A has had, vaporized marijuana versus smoked marijuana versus edible marijuana. What are the dosages? What kind of effects are out there? And looking at this as a baseline so that the recreational market can utilize that data and make sure that it's even safer labeling and recommendations moving forward. Are you guys having access to those type of programs or funds right at this time?
So at this time for the Compassion Club, no. We've been engaged in civil disobedience for 20 years, and so we don't engage in official research with the government in any way. We don't receive any kind of government subsidies. And just speaking of subsidies, I just want to segue a little bit to just let you know that the employees at the Compassion Club generally earn less than $25,000 a year. So we're talking about people that are really working for very little to provide these additional healthcare services. In terms of data collection, because we haven't had access to cannabinoid testing, we haven't been able to collect data that will give us correlations between cannabinoid profiles and symptom management. What we are able to do within our own, sort of little bubble is that we keep immaculate records of what the clients are consuming. So anything that a patient is consuming, we know all the way back until if they registered with us 18 years ago, we have a profile on them of every single thing, every time they ever procured something from us. And if they have any feedback for us about what worked for them or what didn't work, it can get put down in their patient profile. Now, we haven't, brought all of that data together, but we've been creating it in a way that we can really create specialized patient service on a one-on-one basis. But I would say that we are an organization that is ripe for working with a research organization. We, having the huge patient base and the incredible amount of experience that we have.
I think you have valuable experience there, and like I said, there's 288 days left before this moves in. And it's just, I think you would agree then with Colorado, it would be good if we had these resources and baseline data available as we move forward, eh?
Well, and I think even more so than data, what's important is the common sense education around maximizing benefits and minimizing risk.
Yes.
And that's a place where we have a tremendous body of knowledge, and there are, pretty simple recommendations that you can give people around how to avoid adverse effects with ingesting cannabis, how to make sure you're not driving impaired, how to make sure that you're not operating machinery while impaired. These are things that we have been navigating for 20 years.
Thank you.
Okay, now we go to Mr. Oliver.
Thank you very much. The questioning, Ms. Bogdan, around, we heard from witness after witness after witness. It's been a long journey since we saw you Monday morning. But the the importance of public education on this and getting it going now is absolutely paramount. So it's great to hear the initiatives that are there. And you're right, there was a very good presentation from the one group, and they had produced quite an excellent document, which I'm going to take home with me and use, because the way they had you speaking to youth about marijuana was a very thoughtful approach. So thank you for that. Bill C-45 is quiet, though, on public education. Some jurisdictions, I think, suggested that they were sort of mandated to take a percentage of the proceeds from the sale of marijuana or cannabis for education. Are you happy with C-45 as it is now? And I guess the educational component, the public health message, resides elsewhere in the health department and will be a continuing, ongoing strategy for health, or does it need to be in the bill itself, do you think?
Thank you for that question. As I said in the answer to a question from another member, the public education is a very important part of the government strategy. Taking a public health approach to cannabis or tobacco is about maximizing public education and minimizing the risks of use. So, in answer to my question of one of the other honourable members, I talked about, sort of the work that we have underway now, right, to talk to young Canadians about cannabis use, make sure that they're thinking about the health risks. That's the part of the work that we're doing now. Our work will turn in the weeks and months ahead, planning for the perspective, if this bill is passed by Parliament, to do as other members have suggested and other witnesses before this committee, and perhaps working, in concert with other partners who have this to get additional information out.
I'd encourage you, whether the bill passes or not, given the prevalence of the use of marijuana in youth, the more you're doing and health is doing, getting those public messages out, the better. And the sooner and the more, the better. I just wanted to change. So I understand from the BC Compassion Club Society, their recommendation number 5, that edibles are not illegal, are not yet a permitted form from the licensed manufacturers. Is that right?
Licensed producers are able to distribute cannabis oil that is not for inhalation, but that is used for consumption.
Yes.
So you can take the oil directly
So you can buy the
on
oil
a spoon or a syringe, or you can take it home and produce baked goods out of it.
But in terms of some of the other things we've heard from other jurisdictions, like Colorado, where there's quite a robust market.
No, when we talk about edible products other than infused oils, they are not currently allowed from the licensed producers.
So one of the concerns, this has been a very prevalent concern raised by witnesses, that edibles should be part of Bill C-45 for some very good public health reasons. One, because otherwise people are primarily going to be smoking and inhaling, and because the black market or the other market has competing goods in this area. So what we heard, I think, on Monday was that it was too soon, that the experience from Colorado was that launching edibles would take some time, and there was complex regulation, so it wasn't included. But it's been 3 years now, and I'm sure that the medical marijuana users have been advocating for, manufactured edibles for some time now, for 3 or 4 years. So it leads me to wonder what's happened. Like, why hasn't health addressed this? Or you just don't think it's an important component of the market? Or why haven't you addressed it for the medical marijuana group, and then you would have had the regulations and things ready for recreational?
I guess what I would offer is that the enabling the production of cannabis oil, when the licensed industry first began, it was only for dried cannabis. And enabling licensed producers to begin producing cannabis oil is a relatively recent feature of the system, addition to the system, in part in response to a federal court decision. It would be the summer of 2015, I believe. A year before I started this job, if I got that right. So we have really focused on, we put those regulations in place, which allow producers to produce cannabis oil as as Ms. Black mentioned, in a variety of different forms, and have been working with those who are interested in increasing the supply of that. So I think that has really been a focus, is enabling those licensed producers that want to increase
But
that.
I think
so
you'd
we
agree
can ensure
that
it's available.
Colorado, I know you've been down there, they have an incredibly diverse range of edible products.
Absolutely.
And why haven't you allowed that to develop, or why hasn't Health Canada come out with guidelines around that for at least the medical marijuana consumption?
Well, as I said, we haven't contemplated, authorizing a broader range of products.
And why is that?
Why is that? I think we were focused on enabling, the cannabis oil and building that industry, putting those regulations in place. We were focused on that. Our minds might have turned to looking at other products. And then with the change of government and a commitment to legalize and strictly regulate it, I think we've put some energy and attention into that, supporting the government on that.
So there's no other reason why you wouldn't be proceeding with edible products, and there's no other...
No, absolutely not. I mean, that is, I think we recognize, as many of the witnesses before this committee have this week, that we should be doing everything possible to enable people to consume cannabis in ways that will be safer methods of consumption, and will minimize the harms. That is why this legislation contemplates bringing into force regulations for products, such as edibles or concentrates and other things. I think, so that's contemplated by this bill.
Great, thank you very much.
Sorry.
Mr. Davies.
Well, Ms. Bogdan, the curiosity to me is that, yes, the legislation contemplates edibles, but it doesn't legalize it. And we're the Health Committee, you're the ADM of Health. Is it not the case that smoking cannabis is the least healthy way of ingesting cannabis?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yet, ironically, that's C-45. The focus of it is to break out, first and foremost, smoking cannabis, which is the least healthy way to do it, and leaving edibles and other products that are many patients prefer because they don't have to smoke. We're leaving that for a future day down the road. That strikes me as perverse from a health point of view.
So, could I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the legislation contemplates a range of products. When the legislation comes into force, there will be both dried, which, as some of the panelists here today have acknowledged, people are consuming it by vaporizing and things like that. But more importantly, it will also enable people to access cannabis oil, which is produced under strict regulated circumstances. You can ingest it either by drinking it. You can put it in your tea. People can bake it into baked goods. There are many different ways that they consume it, but it's very important that as of next July, people will have access to a regulated, quality-controlled supply of cannabis oil, which is a healthier way to, if they choose to ingest it, if they choose to use cannabis, a healthier way to do that.
My understanding is that the problems with the oil when it comes to vaping is that the THC percentage of 3% mean that vaporizing that THC at that concentration is not sufficient to give people the concentration of THC that they'll need. And the other thing, of course, is by leaving that oil to be produced by Canadians, I guess, in their kitchens, we really don't control then the mold and the sanitation and the concentration and dosage, the child-proof containers that those products may end up in, I guess is my point. But
Could I respond to that,
I'm going to
Mr.
just
Chair?
turn Ms. Bogdan, because I want to have a couple of questions for Ms. Black in my limited time. Ms. Black, I wanted to ask you about advertising. One of your recommendations is to ensure that advertising restrictions do not unduly limit the capacity for service providers to provide education and convey product characteristics and help instill consumer confidence in this new regulation. Now, we've heard some testimony that really sets a very, very dire message, this committee, about advertising. And, we don't want it in sports facilities. We don't want it on billboards. We don't want to convey lifestyle advertising. I understand that. What is your testimony, what do you mean by your recommendation?
Thank you for the question. Before I answer it, may I clarify something for your previous question?
Yes.
So the restrictions, as I understand them, I just want to be clear that the restrictions in the oils that are currently available, they're not for vaporizing. So those are for ingestion only. I also just wanted to make a comment that we sort of like that. Inhalation is a very important mode of administration, and it can be done very safely when a vaporizer is used properly. I want to make sure that we're not demonizing it in terms of patients. Using inhalation and the immediate onset of symptom relief is very important. My understanding is that the restrictions in the ACMPR currently is 30 milligrams of THC per milliliter. I'm not quite sure where the 3% number came from, and 30 milligrams of THC is quite a lot. When I'm teaching patients how to use cannabis for the first time, if they're using oil, I have them start with 2.5 milligrams and wait till the next day before they increase it. So I just wanted to clarify that. In terms of advertising, I mean, from the Compassion Club perspective, we would like to be able to do more patient outreach. We have always worked very hard to be compliant with every bylaw, every little law we can possibly be compliant with while we break the big ones. So we don't do any patient outreach into other patient groups that could really benefit from our services because we don't want to be contravening any of the advertising regulations. 2 years ago, we received a letter from Health Canada that was fairly heavy-handed in terms of informing us that the menu that we had on our website and on our telephone line, that if we didn't immediately cease and desist, there was going to be $1 million worth of fines and years in jail. And so we immediately complied. So most of the other unregulated dispensaries in Vancouver and the online ones have not complied in the same way that we have. And as a result, we are losing revenue quite significantly, which is impacting our ability to provide patient services. And I would suggest that the same thing will happen for the legal market. If the legal market is handcuffed in terms of being able to talk about the effects of the products, or to be able to talk about the qualities of the products, or even the nature of the company who has produced them, that you're going to give a substantial advantage to players that are producing cannabis in an unregulated market.
Thank you. Just quickly,
Sorry, time's up. But I do want to give Ms. Bogdan a chance to answer a question. I think you wanted to make a comment a while ago?
Actually, I think Ms. Black provided the precision that I wanted to, that the cannabis oil is, quality controlled and it's actually ingested. It wouldn't be inhaled, that people are available, and the 30 milligrams per milliliter, and that is actually a significant quality controlled dose that would be available.
That brings to an end our normal circuit of questions, but I had a question for Ms. Black. What, in your opinion, why will nobody apply to have medical marijuana listed and assigned a number?
So this is not my area of expertise, but from a layperson, my understanding is that when you are applying for a drug approval status and you have to go through human clinical trials, that you have to do that with each individual active ingredient in the medicine that you're looking to get approval for. So cannabis has over 80 active cannabinoids, and then there's a whole other class of active ingredients called terpenoids or terpenes, which are responsible for the flavor and the smell that distinguish the strains. But we're starting to understand, emerging evidence is showing us that the terpenes also interact with our endocannabinoid system and have therapeutic effects. So my understanding is that cannabis is a very complex plant, and it doesn't fit easily into the pathway of the way that we regulate pharmaceutical medicines, which are often single active ingredients. So it's a plant, it has many of these different active ingredients, and again, not my area of expertise, but I also understand that you have to go through clinical trials for each one of the indications that you're looking for approval for, and cannabis is used for such an incredibly wide range of symptoms.
Okay, thanks
So
very much.
maybe we'll be able to put our heads together and see if we can come up with a solution and find a way forward.
Well, if we can help you, we'd like to do that. Now, I'm getting all kinds of signals from over here, hand signals and...
You know what I'm going to say. We have some time remaining, and so I would like to seek unanimous consent. Now, here's the twist, to have each party have 5 minutes to ask questions.
Each party to have 5 minutes to ask questions. Well, if you want to, we'll go back to the original round one, which is 5-minute questions.
I would accept that amendment.
Is there unanimous consent? No unanimous consent, so we can't.
All right.
All right, well, that brings to a close our meeting, and again, I want to, on behalf of the committee, you're great witnesses, and I especially want to thank Mr. Zaid and Madame Elizabeth for sharing your personal stories with us, because these are the stories that really mean something to us, and you've made a difference. You've made a difference here by coming today and testifying, so I want to thank you all for your testimony on behalf of all the members of the committee. So I hereby suspend the meeting. And when do we come back?
1:45.
1:45, we're back. Only